Mendocino County resident, kind of Rhode Valley specifically. Technically I was born in Ukiah, but kind of had this evolving love-hate relationship with fire. Now, like the first fire that I was in was on the farm that I worked on about, starting 20 years ago, but about 15 years ago. Kind of my landlord, her basically house burned down, and it was like one of the first things ever built in Red Valley. It was like 4,000 square foot original shipping cabin, and yeah, that was extremely traumatic. You know, it started catching the forest on fire, and I was basically able to defend my little house that I lived in, like maybe 50 yards away from the house. And by the time the fire department came, I was starting to fall trees because it was starting to forest on fire. So previous to that, I had thought about becoming a volunteer firefighter, but actually after having gone through a fire, I was so traumatized, I was like, no, I never want to do that again. And then I had this large gap, and eventually moved to where I'm at now. Now I'm on Laughlin Ridge, which is just east of Reeves Canyon Road, near the bottom of the Willits Grade. My wife and I own and operate Mendocino Organics. Our landlord is Golden Vineyards. They have the vineyards you can see as you're coming down the Willits Grade. They have about 1,000 acres that's parallel north-south with 101 that butts up to Ridgewood Ranch on the east side of the freeway, and another 1,000 acres that runs on Laughlin Ridge, east-west, basically going kind of toward Conkai. And so we had a close call about 7 or 8 years before the Redwood Fire, where there was fire at Ridgewood Ranch. It burned quite a bit, and it didn't quite get to our property, but you know, ashes started to fall, and where you get freaked out, and like, oh. So I packed up everything and moved, especially since then I lived on the ranch, and I lived pretty close to where our border with Ridgewood Ranch was. So then July of 2017, we basically got kind of a warm-up with the grade fire. There was a fire that started on the side of the freeway with a truck, and I actually, ironically, had happened to be there. You know, after going through the different fires, I realized like we need to have like an evacuation plan for our animals. We have sheep, cows, and you know, in our case, we have so many animals. It's like you're not just gonna like load them up in a trailer and run, because we need like half a dozen trailers to load everybody up. It's more of like, where can we have this like safe, defendable area, and ideally we would be able to be there and be in a position to gather them, herd them out of the bushes. So it actually worked. Like, you know, it's like one of those random things. For like 2 years, I've like mentally prepared myself, like, if this ever happens, like, this is just what you have to do. Like, to where when it finally happens, like, you don't really think about it, because if you really think about it, it could overwhelm you, because it's like pretty crazy when everything's burning. You're trying to get everybody out, but it worked, you know, like, and it was like, wow, that was actually like a good experience that I had with fire. Like, it wasn't really good because we had about 300 acres burned that damaged a lot of fencing and burned like a lot of our pasture that was fenced. But then it was good in that, you know, the Redwood Fire came, you know, just a few months later, and so all our animals were basically already contained, so that took one thing out of the equation. You know, but during the Redwood Fire, basically 1,900 out of the 2,000 acres burned. You know, and we were able to defend like sort of civilization where vineyards and orchards and buildings are, with basically mostly with 2 people. Primarily because it had been set up, like our former vineyard manager who developed most of the ranch was a volunteer firefighter for 20 years. And all these things that he was really strict on, like we really have to mow like early and often, and we have to mow 10 feet on the side of all our roads, and we have to do all these things. It just seemed like, that's a little overkill. You know, but then in October, it's like, wow, that actually really worked. You know, you know, in a lot of people's cases, I tell them like, you know, you should do what you can, like fuel reduction, mow around your house, you know, make your place as defensible as possible, but like in most cases you should probably really leave, you know, like unless you're really prepared to do that, like both physically and personally and with the resources, like, you know, until you actually go through something like that, it's like you can't really imagine. But yeah, like it's like one of those things you don't just kind of like, I'm gonna do this and like freak out when it happens. You know, like that's kind of the last thing that you want to do, because especially now, I am actually a volunteer firefighter. Like I've kind of become desensitized enough to it that I'm like, well, kind of went through it. I've had like good experiences where I was able to fence up. It's not so bad. I didn't freak out. You know, well, I freaked out the first time, like really bad actually. But then, but yeah, like most people, I like, you know, you should just have your evacuation plan, kind of know what you're gonna do, and like don't make yourself a liability to first responders. That, you know, our first responsibility is personal safety. you know, so like, if they're trying to defend you, they can't defend your house. But if you're, like in the case of my landlords, they, you know, have quite a bit of resources, like, then go for it, you know, but then just realize like, kind of what you're getting yourself into. Like, and that was part of, for me and my plan of like, all right, we're gonna have, herd the animals out of the bushes, you gotta think like, well, this could go south and you could burn. Basically, it's like, you kind of have to be prepared, like, is that really what you wanna do? Like, and if you're not prepared for that to happen, then don't do it. You know, so October happened, and we were able to basically defend everything, but then most of the rangeland all burned. That even the stuff that had burned the first time in July burned again, which is kind of amazing that even areas that burn, they can actually burn again after everything burns. You're like, I didn't really think there was anything left to burn, but there is. You know, especially when you have 50-mile-per-hour winds. And so I spent about 3 days basically on the fire line, like on the dozer lines that were cut, defending different areas. And but I think 2 days after that, I was like basically the first person in the NRCS office, like basically ready for government assistance. Because I knew, like, once I heard that it was a disaster, I was like, sweet, we're gonna get money. And like it's someone like Evan had said, you know, it's like, a lot of people I talk to were like, oh, I'm not really sure it's government money. They feel like too proud to take it. It's like, dude, like once you really start processing months later, like you should really take it. You know, like even we get disaster assistance for basically all the forage that burned, but even like we end up still basically calling out our animals because you can't, like, unless you have a bunch of hay that you cut or something, like it's, or like other forage that didn't burn, like you just, it's hard to afford to feed your way out of it. And then in our case, so yeah, we were basically one of the first in line to go to get NRCS assistance, which basically, besides just paying for like forage losses, also paid for building a lot of fencing. So, you know, previous to the fires, we had 300 acres fenced that got damaged, and then afterwards, we now have like 800 acres fenced, and the fence that was damaged got fixed, or most of it got fixed. And then the Ridgewood, or the ridge land, basically, which was mostly forest land, it's finally getting salvage logs. Like it, you know, mostly was conifer forest. That after talking with foresters and NRCS people, that you know a lot of the places here in inland Mendocino County, unless you're in a cool, wet area, riparian areas on the north side of slopes, like most of what we see is like this conifer forest isn't necessarily natural. You know, it's like something that's come about that the native people used to burn to keep land open, and oak woodland grassland, because that was some of their staple foods. And you know, that was the tool that they used to like maintain what was a productive landscape for them. Europeans came, brought livestock, continued burning, you know, around the 40s, 50s, 60s, just as more people started moving out into some of these big ranches, those tools started coming away that people didn't want to use. Like livestock started disappearing, fire started disappearing, and so then we get this huge growth of fuel, you know, that especially in the context of the world we live in today with people, operator error, I guess you can call it, you know, people just being either careless or just making a mistake, like, you know, getting a flat tire and then burning 50,000 acres. You know, it's like we really like need to take that context, like, and realize like, okay, we need to manage things a lot differently. And so now we're after the salvage logging, which out of 1,000 acres, I think it's probably like 500 acres or something of timber. I think the estimate I've been told is probably like 2 million board feet once they finish logging. That, you know, like legally we don't have to replant it back to forest, so very likely we're not. Like, you know, enough trees, especially oak trees, either they survived or they're sprouting back. Not all the conifers died, but probably about 80% of them. But basically we're just gonna move forward with what our vision of what should be the landscape, you know, one that's safe, one that's still productive, you know, especially in our case, we raise livestock, so, you know, as much as I like trees, like, well, conifers don't feed cows. So, yeah, it's like in some ways I don't really feel guilty, but it feels weird, like that in some ways we've benefited, you know, it's like partially just because we're trying to make like the best of a bad situation and make it kind of safer for our neighbors. Like after we're done, like we basically have virtual freeways now, that for some of our neighbors, most of our neighbors lost their houses because we're on the the properties on the ridge line on that slope above West Road in Redwood Valley, one of the hardest places hit during the Redwood fire. And so I'm guessing like 80% of the houses were lost. Like, I think from the people that I drive through or whatever above their house, I only see like 2 houses that survived. And so at least for them, they'll have like more exits, and hopefully just we'll manage it in a way that, it'll never really get that catastrophic again.
Does anyone have any questions? Thank you, Adam, for sharing your experience.
How's the costing going in terms of dealing with all the burnt trees that are sort of beyond? How's the costing going of that? Like,
I'm not sure. Like, that's kind of not my department. Like with logging, like you pay for the logging itself. So my landlord's been footing the bill for the forester, for the guys that are doing the logging, for the roads that are being built to accommodate all the logging equipment. Because they're literally the 3 cell phone towers you can see on Laughlin Ridge. 2 of them are on Ridgewood's property, and then 1 of them is on my landlord's property. And so like now they're literally driving logging trucks in between those towers and actually around them. And it's definitely going to make money. I think they're not really going to know until kind of after the fact. And at least with my landlords, they're, they never really wanted, obviously, the October fire to happen. And they actually had a house in Mark West Springs, literally right across the street from Carlin Lumen's school in Sonoma County. And so they basically, when they left, the ball field at Carlin Lumen was on fire, and they drove by Willie's Wine Bar, if anyone knows where that's at, and it was fully engulfed. And they're thinking whoa, that was crazy, we're gonna go home, we're safe, and they got to Cloverdale, and then had gotten a call I'm sorry, but your ranch is burning, and Adam and Jerry, the vineyard manager, they're trying to save things. So and for them, they're in a financial position where it's not like they really need to make the money or whatever. So the idea afterwards is to try to push it into whatever vision we want it to be, more fencing, possibly. We're actually, once the logging's done, we have these huge slash piles. It's just kind of amazing, sort of how violent logging is. It's basically like harvesting broccoli or corn. It's pretty, especially in the case where everything burns. It's and then with the new road building too, it's just it's kind of intense to see. But then all the slash piles will get burned, and ideally for me, it just gets kind of everything gets burned. Everything that's dead and burnt will get burned again. And now that we basically have these literally freeway, 2-lane roads, where you can drive a heavy equipment trailer up into, surrounding probably I think 400 or 500 acres. Actually the other day I was thinking I just actually want to burn it again. Not just the piles, but I just want to drip torch and burn everything again, because we have star thistle starting to come in. And just to clean slate it spring of next year, so that going into fall, it's better for aerial seeding. And that was one thing that we had done too after the October fire, was we aerial seeded about 500 acres. With pasture grass, they put an airplane, and there's a lot of crops actually that are seeded by airplane. Rice is one of them. A lot of rice is seeded by airplane. So there was a local kid that had grown up on Tomkai, right across from the Fry's actually, and used to fly for CAL FIRE, and then now he's an aerial applicator, crop duster over in Fresno. But he came over to help people, recover or whatever, and did the aerial seeding at about half the cost of what it normally is, which is $10 an acre, which is just for the flying, which is pretty cheap, considering that there's no way we could have done that by hand or in the train. We can't. We can't even drive a quad on all of it. So.
And I got a question. So that seeding that kept the erosion down this last winter.
Yeah, it definitely did. We in the forest land, there was enough residual matter, especially the area of Mecanos, that they kind of oh my god, I got burned, and then all the leaves fell, so that helped. But definitely in some areas that I've driven around, especially Glen Ellen, I'd want to like buy goats from somebody in Glen Ellen, cause that's one thing that we're starting to really expand is raising a lot of goats. And I just couldn't, it looked like the moon still, like even after a year, I was just like amazed, I was like, wow, it looks like nothing's really growing back here. And I mean, after some of the workshops that I went to, they say that, you know, everything being equal, like if you have the same kind of normal rainfall year, that after a fire, like normally in terms of forage production, that it's like 30%, you know, if you do nothing, you know, and I'd estimate that, well, the first year we didn't even graze it, we actually let it grow, which was kind of crazy, like we let grass literally grow like 6 foot tall, and luckily we didn't have fires last year, but then, actually Kyle's family brought in cattle, because now we had so much forage that we didn't have enough animals, but we do need to keep it managed, to keep it, you know, grazed down, you know, both for the productivity of the forage, but also for fire safety. And so I think, I mean, probably the first year, I mean, we probably were at like 60 to 70% of quote unquote normal, and now I think it looks pretty good.